Japan had begun its expansion beyond its borders at the beginning of the 20th century. After successfully supporting the victorious side in World War I, it invaded Manchuria in 1931 and then China in 1937. The United States took no action. It wasn't until the Japanese invasion of Indochina in 1940 that Washington reacted, imposing an embargo on oil exports to Japan in 1941. Lacking oil resources of its own, Japan decided to take control of the rich reserves in Southeast Asia, particularly the Dutch East Indies. To do so, and to secure access to the rest of its growing empire, it needed to dominate the Pacific Ocean. To that end, Japan first attempted to destroy the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, thus bringing the United States into the war. The attack was devastating. 4 battleships were sunk, 188 aircraft destroyed, and another 159 damaged. However, by chance, the American aircraft carriers were not in base. Despite the Japanese success, the American fleet remained a serious threat to any Japanese expansion plans in the Pacific. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet and mastermind behind the attack, knew the war wasn't over. The Americans knew it too. The next time Yamamoto went to sea, he would be a formidable enemy. In the months following Pearl Harbor, the Pacific Fleet limited itself to minor attacks on lightly defended targets. These raids gave the Navy time to reorganize and keep its men in shape. One of these seemingly insignificant attacks had an unexpected effect. In April 1942, the aircraft carrier Hornet launched a daring air raid on Tokyo with 16 B-25 bombers commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle. After releasing their bombs, the planes flew to China, where they were to land and refuel. However, the landing plans failed, and almost all of the planes had to crash or crash-land. Despite seeming like a pointless disaster, the operation had an enormous psychological impact. It showed that Japan was not invulnerable. Faced with the latent threat, Japan decided to capture Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea with the aim of severing the Allied link with Australia, which served as a base for operations in the Pacific. On May 3, 1942, the Japanese invasion forces landed without resistance. But what Yamamoto didn't know was that American intelligence had deciphered his plans. While he celebrated the landing, 2 American aircraft carrier groups were approaching. The ensuing battle, which lasted 4 days, was fierce and ended without a clear winner, although the Japanese managed to sink the aircraft carrier Lexington. However, they failed to occupy Moresby, leaving open the dispute for dominance of the Pacific. While this battle was still unfolding, the chief of the Japanese naval staff, Admiral Osamu Nagano, had already given the order to invade Midway. In 1942, Japan faced a strategic dilemma: how to deliver a decisive blow to a power as powerful as the United States. Attacking the US mainland was unfeasible, and there were few targets of real value left. Japan needed a significant objective for the Americans, one that was militarily attainable and could also be held under control once conquered. Midway Atoll, located in the middle of the Pacific, was vital to the Americans as an aerial refueling point and naval base. Eastern Island housed the airstrip, while Sand Island housed hangars, workshops, fuel and ammunition depots, radio stations, and other logistical facilities. If Japan captured the atoll, it would seriously weaken the American ability to interfere with its shipping lanes between the East Indies and the Japanese archipelago. For Yamamoto, capturing Midway meant expanding Japan's offensive capabilities in the region. In his view, no other objective could simultaneously offer such massive damage to the United States and such significant gains to Japan. All it needed was a good plan and the element of surprise. Unfortunately, he failed to secure either. The execution of the plan fell to Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the Kido Aircraft Carrier Force Butai. Although Nagumo had serious doubts about the feasibility of the operation, he was in no position to oppose it. He had already been against the attack on Pearl Harbor, which weakened his political clout. An expert on torpedoes, he was considered a conservative officer, inflexible and prone to panic. During the Battle of Midway, this lack of initiative would prove fatal. But he had obtained the position through seniority, and although Yamamoto doubted his ability, he had no choice but to leave him in command. The road to the Battle of Midway. Yamamoto's plans and Nimitz's response. The idea of attacking Midway was conceived in early 1942, but its implementation was delayed due to the controversial and complex nature of the plan. Yamamoto's original design was relatively simple, but in order to be approved, he had to accept a series of modifications imposed by other commanders, many of which he himself had unsuccessfully attempted to reject. As a result, the final operation ended up divided into two simultaneous and independent actions: an air attack against the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, Operation AL, and the main offensive against Midway, Operation AM, which involved both the invasion of the atoll and the destruction of the American aircraft carriers. For years, Western historians assumed that the Aleutians' attack had been simply a diversion to draw attention away from Midway. However, recent research has shown that Japanese planners treated the two operations as separate and unconnected. This decision contradicted one of the fundamental principles of warfare: the decisive concentration of forces. The core of Admiral Isoroku's strategic plan. Yamamoto's strategy for the offensive against Midway was based on a diversionary and annihilation maneuver. He wanted to lure the American aircraft carriers away from Pearl Harbor, away from their main base, in order to ambush them in the open sea through the concentrated use of Japanese air and naval force. Yamamoto was fully aware that the American aircraft carriers were the backbone of the American naval offensive capability, and therefore focused his strategy on eliminating them completely. His objective was not so much the territorial conquest of the Midway Atoll, but to provoke a decisive battle that would eliminate the American naval threat in the Central Pacific and guarantee Japanese hegemony in the region. The plan called for Midway to be attacked and captured before the Americans could mount an effective defense. Yamamoto assumed that American forces would not intervene until the attack on the atoll was underway or even complete. This assumption was critical, as it allowed the Japanese forces to be divided into several groups without fear of premature intervention. His carrier force, consisting of the Akagi, Kaga, Hiryū, and Sōryū, the core of the Kido Butai, was to be kept in reserve, hidden north of Midway, to attack enemy aircraft carriers by surprise as soon as they came to defend the island. Furthermore, Yamamoto underestimated the U.S. Navy's resilience after the Battle of the Coral Sea, which had occurred just weeks earlier. He was convinced that at least 2 U.S. aircraft carriers had been sunk or were disabled, giving Japan a decisive numerical advantage in naval aircraft units. He believed that with air and tactical superiority, his pilots, trained for years and with recent combat experience, would easily defeat the U.S. forces. Operation AM, the attack on Midway, and Operation AL, the secondary offensive against the Aleutians in the North Pacific, were part of a larger scheme aimed at confusing the Americans about the true point of attack. But in practice, this dispersion weakened the concentration of forces, breaking an essential principle of naval warfare: critical mass. The enormous distance between the different Japanese fleets made a coordinated response to the unexpected impossible. For Yamamoto, the success of Midway was more than a mere tactical victory. He considered it a sine qua non for the long-term viability of Japanese expansionism. He was so convinced of the plan's importance that, encountering resistance from the high command in Tokyo, particularly the Naval General Staff and Admiral Osamu Nagano, he went so far as to threaten to resign if the operation was not approved. His authority and prestige within the Imperial Navy, as well as his key role in planning the attack on Pearl Harbor, gave him the political clout to ultimately impose his will. Thus was born the plan that would lead Japan to its first major strategic defeat in the Pacific. Japan's early success in the Pacific had engendered a dangerous sense of invulnerability among its naval commanders. This overconfidence led them to downplay risks and ignore troubling facts, even during war games simulating the attack on Midway. In one such game, the aircraft carriers Akagi and Kaga were sunk. This arrogance carried over into the actual plan. Yamamoto not only wrongly assumed that the American carriers would not sail until Midway was attacked, but he also failed to contemplate any contingency plans in case he was wrong. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy was routinely intercepting Japanese naval transmissions. Captain Joseph Rochefort, one of the world's most experienced cryptographers, headed the intelligence center, Station Hypo, in Hawaii. In May 1942, A series of coded messages convinced him that Japan was planning an attack on a target identified as AF, planned for late May or early June. Rochefort suspected that AF was Midway, but his superiors were unwilling to act solely on that basis. It was Jasper Holmes, another hypo officer, who devised a plan to confirm this. The Midway garrison was asked to transmit a clear message informing them that their desalination plant had stopped operating. A few days later, Japanese intelligence ordered their invading forces to bring additional water purification equipment to AF. That confirmation was enough to convince Rochefort, who then informed Admiral Chester Nimitz that the attack would be against Midway and that it would take place on June 4th or 5th. The entire American preparation would now depend on Nimitz's decision. At 57, Chester W. Nimitz was Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. After being rejected by the Army, he graduated from the Naval Academy in 1905. During World War I, he served on supply ships in the Atlantic. His career had been steady but not meteoric. He only reached the rank of captain at the age of 42. After the Pearl Harbor disaster, he was appointed to command the fleet with the rank of admiral during one of the darkest moments in American naval history. Rochefort remembered him as a coldly impersonal man. His calm and serene demeanor made him ideal for leadership in times of crisis. He selected his subordinates carefully and, once assigned, trusted them completely. If he took risks, they were always calculated ones. At Midway, he would face the greatest challenge of his career. Hypo's interceptions, Nimitz had a key strategic advantage. He knew the Japanese plans quite accurately. While Yamamoto believed he was setting a trap for Nimitz, it was Nimitz who was actually preparing an ambush for Yamamoto. On May 27th, he convened his staff. When the meeting began, Rochefort had not yet arrived. Shortly after, he rushed in with a handful of new decrypted messages. "This explains everything," he told the admiral. The documents contained key details of the Japanese plan, location, date, forces involved, and even the planned positions of the enemy aircraft carriers. Although he initially suspected it might be a hoax, Nimitz soon realized the information was reliable. His plan was structured in 3 parts. A small force would be sent north to respond to the Aleutians attack. The defense of Midway Atoll itself would be organized, and finally, an offensive operation would be planned to destroy the enemy aircraft carriers. Nimitz had the aircraft carriers Enterprise and Hornet, and if the Yorktown could be repaired quickly, he would have 3 units ready to face the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. Added to this was the unsinkable base represented by Midway Atoll itself. The weak point of the American force was the inferiority of its aircraft. The Japanese Mitsubishi, a 6M20 fighter, vastly outclassed the American fighters. This long-range, single-seat fighter was the primary combat aircraft of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Known for its exceptional maneuverability and range, the Zero was feared by Allied pilots during the early years of the war. However, its lack of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks made it vulnerable in combat. The Brewster F-2A3 Buffalo was slow and clumsy, and should have been replaced by the Grumman F-4 Wildcat. This single-seat fighter was the primary combat aircraft of the United States Navy in the early years of the war. Although outmaneuvered by the Zero, the Wildcat boasted a rugged design, self-sealing fuel tanks, and heavy armament, allowing it to withstand significant damage and remain operational. The only truly effective aircraft would be the Douglas SBD-3 Dauntless dive bomber, although it required air cover to survive. Despite these disadvantages, Nimitz assembled a force of 3 aircraft carriers, 231 aircraft, 7 heavy cruisers, and other escort units. He planned to position this force in the open sea before the Japanese could establish a submarine encirclement around Hawaii. The staging point was designated Point Luck, located at 32 degrees north, 173 degrees west. From there, they could launch their attack on June 4th. Operational command of the group was to fall to Admiral William Halsey, but upon returning ill after 6 months at sea, he was hospitalized. Nimitz then chose between 2 rear admirals, Frank Jack Fletcher and Raymond Spruance. Fletcher was a competent strategic commander, though reserved and uninterested in self-promotion. He had been in command at the Coral Sea and would now be given overall command at Midway. Spruance, on the other hand, was discreet, intelligent, and highly respected, considered to be on par with Halsey. Eventually, Fletcher assumed overall command with Spruance in charge of Task Force 1, Force 16, Enterprise and Hornet, and Fletcher leading the Task Force 17, Yorktown. The Yorktown, fresh from combat, was severely damaged. A bomb had pierced its flight deck and exploded inside. Still, more than 1,400 crewmen worked tirelessly, improvising urgent repairs. Incredibly, 3 days later, the Yorktown sailed to join Nimitz's force. The Japanese expedition consisted of a main force of surface ships, a first attack force with the aircraft carriers Akagi and Kaga, a second attack force with Hiryū and Sōryū, and an invasion force. In total, they carried 248 aircraft, including Aichi D-3A dive bombers, Nakajima B-5N2 torpedo bombers, and Zero fighters. But their most serious weakness was the lack of reconnaissance aircraft, which would have fatal consequences. Fletcher and Spruance had 231 aircraft on board, supported by 127 aircraft based at Midway, under the command of Captain Cyril Simard. In numbers, the Japanese had twice the number of torpedo bombers, while the Americans had 40% more dive bombers. Both sides were evenly matched in fighters, but the United States had 4 times as many reconnaissance aircraft. Furthermore, only the Americans had land-based heavy bombers, B-17 and B-26. Even so, the American aircraft were generally inferior. The Douglas TBD-1 Devastator torpedo bombers were virtually slaughtered. This 3-seat torpedo bomber was the U.S. Navy's primary attack aircraft at the start of the war. However, by 1942, the Devastator was already obsolete, with inferior speed and maneuverability and lacking adequate armor. It suffered heavy losses during the Battle of Midway and was quickly replaced by the Grumman TBF Avenger. Buffalo fighters were no match for the nimble Zeros. Fortunately, the Dauntless proved decisive. The United States was determined to prevent Japan from capturing Midway at all costs. The island was reinforced with new aircraft, primarily long-range aircraft. The total number of aircraft on the atoll reached approximately 130. Bunkers were built, trenches dug, and mines and coastal defenses deployed. By May 24th, the facilities were at 200% operational capacity. 19 submarines patrolled the area. Had the Japanese landed, they would have encountered a well-prepared and ironclad defense. On the way to battle, the complex and timed Japanese plan began to unravel even before the ships sailed. On May 25th, Vice Admiral Nagumo announced that his aircraft carriers were not ready. They needed an additional day to resupply. Departure, scheduled for the 26th, was delayed to May 27th. However, the date of the landing at Midway could not be postponed as it was coordinated with the lunar phase. This forced a crucial change. Now, the Japanese aircraft carriers would have to engage the American fleet before the invasion troops took the atoll. Nagumo then departed for Midway on May 27th with 4 carriers and 248 aircraft, easily overpowering the atoll's defenses. Still, he likely regretted losing so many veteran pilots in the previous 6 months of war. It was unclear whether the rookie aviators replacing them would be up to the task. The next day, another setback further weakened Yamamoto's plans. He had ordered 2 Kawanishi H-8K flying boats to spy on Pearl Harbor, which required an intermediate stop for resupply at French frigate Reef. Shoals. But when the tanker submarines arrived, they discovered that the Americans had already occupied the area with warships. Without a resupply point, Yamamoto had to cancel his long-range reconnaissance. Had it not been for that setback, he would have discovered that the American aircraft carriers were not at Pearl Harbor, and perhaps would have rethought his strategy. As Nagumo's fleet approached, his radio operators began intercepting an unusual volume of signals from Hawaii. In addition, several Japanese submarines detected enemy submarines and anomalous air movements near Midway. On land, intensive fortification work was observed both day and night. All indications were that the Americans knew the Japanese were coming. On June 2nd, another component of the Japanese plan failed. Yamamoto had arranged for a line of submarines to be deployed around Hawaii to report any movement of the American aircraft carriers. But the designated submarines were too slow and didn't arrive in time. When they finally got into position, the American carriers were already 325 miles north of Midway. Meanwhile, Nagumo continued to advance. straight into the ambush Nimitz had set up. As the American ships moved out to operate, Nimitz wished them good hunting and good luck. All went well in the early stages, although the Hornet lost an aircraft on a patrol mission, and 2 fighters were destroyed in a deck crash over the Yorktown. At Midway, both troops and officers expected a dawn attack every day. Therefore, every day at 4:15 a.m., reconnaissance planes would launch. Shortly afterward, fully loaded B-17s would also take off as they could not land with full tanks. They would fly for 4 hours in case immediate action was needed. This routine increased daily fuel consumption to 65,000 gallons in a tank that only held 150,000. Fearing they would not survive the attack, some officers even removed their rank insignia to avoid being targeted by Japanese snipers. The attack on Midway coincided with the Japanese offensive against the US base at Dutch Harbor in the Aleutians on June 3rd and 4th. Japan considered this point as the gateway to a possible invasion of Alaska. The aircraft carriers Junyo and Ryūjō were assigned to this operation, but they proved to be of little use. Thanks to advance intelligence, the US 11th Air Force was already prepared. When the Japanese planes took off in fog and darkness, almost half failed to even find their target. The few that reached Dutch Harbor faced heavy air defense, with some 150 US planes in the area. They were barely able to make a hit-and-run attack before fleeing. American B-26 bombers counterattacked, and although the material damage was minimal, the cost to Japan was high. One of the Zero fighters had to make an emergency landing with minor damage and was captured intact by the Americans. This discovery allowed for a thorough study of its design and contributed to the development of the Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighter, which would later prove decisive against Japan. Midway strikes back, June 3, 1942. As was customary, June 3rd at Midway began with the roar of reconnaissance planes taking off at dawn. At 9:04 a.m., a patrol reported sighting 2 Japanese cargo ships 470 miles from the atoll, heading 247 degrees and under anti-aircraft defense. This suggested they were part of an invasion force or a reconnaissance advance party. The first contact with the invasion fleet was made by Ensign Jack Reed aboard a Catalina PBY flying boat. He was about to turn back when he noticed strange smudges on his windshield. He called to his co-pilot, Gerald Hardeman. "Are you seeing what I'm seeing?" "Of course you are." What they spotted was a large group of ships heading straight for Midway. Reed radioed, "Main force sighted. Bearing 262, distance 700. Despite the danger, he decided to stay behind to better observe and confirm the report. Upon receiving the news, Nimitz, according to witnesses, smiled with relief. He replied, "This is not, I repeat, not the enemy attack force." By 9:25 a.m., it was clear that a powerful Japanese fleet was approaching. A further report at 11 a.m. indicated the presence of at least 11 enemy vessels. Although this was important, Nimitz's most urgent need was to locate the Japanese aircraft carriers. That afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel Sweeney took off from Midway with 9 B-17 bombers in 3 waves at different altitudes. They sighted heavy cruisers and 30 other vessels. Under anti-aircraft fire, they dropped their bombs. They later reported hits on a cruiser and a transport, although it was later determined that they had not hit any targets. That same night, 4 PBY-5As, newly arrived from Hawaii, took off for a night attack. Lieutenant William Richards thought he was attacking an aircraft carrier, but it was actually a transport. His torpedo exploded, although he was unable to verify the damage. 3 other pilots followed. One of them, Ensign Probst, did score a hit that killed 24 Japanese crew members. But overall, the American torpedoes proved ineffective. While these planes were in the air, Midway accelerated its preparations. Reconnaissance planes were sent to Laysan and Lisiansky, remote islands from which they could operate without interference during the battle. Of the 22 aircraft, only 1 failed to return. In Hawaii, Nimitz anxiously awaited the decisive day. He sent a message to Fletcher and Spruance, "Tomorrow may be the day to give them everything." His optimism was reflected in his June 3rd summary. The entire course of the war in the Pacific may depend on what happens in the next 2 or 3 days. Of course, Juan. Below is the detailed translation and rewriting of this long excerpt, in a clear, technical and narrative style, while maintaining all the key information. Midway under attack, June 4, 1942. In the early hours of June 4, the main Japanese attack force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo was now within range of Midway Atoll. Behind her, some distance away, Admiral Yamamoto's force of battleships and cruisers advanced, ready to finish off any remnants of the American fleet. During the 2 hours before dawn, the crews of the aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryū, and Sōryū worked intensively to prepare the bombers, fighters, and dive planes that would make up the first wave of the attack against Midway. At 4:30 a.m., the first aircraft took off for the atoll. With this action, Yamamoto and Nagumo moved further away from the original objective of the operation, the destruction of the American aircraft carriers. Almost an hour later, Lieutenant Howard Adi, patrolling the ocean, sighted an enemy aircraft en route to Midway. It was part of the first Japanese wave. Adi sent a brief message, "Aircraft," and shortly thereafter reported 0534, enemy carrier, 0540, ED 180, sighting heading 320 degrees. At 5:44, Lieutenant William Chase radioed in clear language, "Many aircraft en route to Midway, heading 320 degrees, range 150 miles. 5 minutes later, Midway's radars had already picked up the formation. The Japanese force was only 93 miles away. However, Chase had only identified 2 carriers, forcing Admiral Fletcher to exercise caution until he confirmed the location of the other 2. With his decks cleared by the attackers' takeoff, Nagumo then ordered reconnaissance aircraft launched eastward in search of the American fleet. One of these, piloted by Petty Officer Amari, took off an hour late and shortened its route. Although it was long suggested that Amari could have detected the American carriers had it performed its mission correctly, recent studies show that its route would not have led it to locate them. Midway confirmed the presence of aircraft carriers leading a large Japanese naval force, located just 180 miles from the atoll. By 5:30 a.m., the American fighter planes were on high alert, and 15 minutes later the order was given to fire their engines. No sooner had this process begun than the air raid sirens sounded. By 6 o'clock there were no operational aircraft left on the ground. 4 B-17s under Captain James Collins and 6 TBF torpedo bombers under Lieutenant Langdon Feeberling were in the air. They were joined by 16 Dauntless dive bombers led by Major Lofton Henderson, 12 SB-2U Vindicator bombers under Major Benjamin Norris, and 25 Buffalo and Wildcat fighters under Major Floyd Parks. When the American fighters intercepted the Japanese formation, around 100 aircraft, they were quickly overrun by the Agile Zero fighters. Some American aircraft were attacked by as many as 5 enemy aircraft at once. Within minutes, 13 Buffaloes and 2 Wildcats were downed. Major Parks, who bravely led the attack, was killed in action. His posthumous decoration praised his bold and aggressive attack against an overwhelmingly superior force, a phrase that sums up the courage with which the American airmen faced the Japanese aircraft. At 6:30, the Japanese force, although somewhat depleted and disorganized, began its bombardment of Midway. Within 2 minutes, hits were reported on the hangars, runways, hospital, and mess hall. At 6:37, a second wave of dive bombers arrived and attacked Eastern Island. Within minutes, fuel tanks were burning and thick plumes of black smoke filled the sky. While some Japanese aircraft were shot down, the damage on the ground was severe. The American anti-aircraft artillery, however, surprised the Japanese with its intensity and accuracy. In just 30 minutes, Nagumo's forces had lost 23% of their aircraft, and 20 pilots failed to return. At 7 o'clock, the base was still operational, a fact that the Japanese commander Joichi Tomonaga acknowledged when he informed Nagumo, "A second attack is needed." The defense had been costly. Of the 27 American fighters, only 12 returned, and 7 were badly damaged. The hangar was destroyed, the power plant was out of service, and the fuel system was rendered useless. The runway, although damaged, was quickly repaired. Midway was still operational, but the enemy aircraft carriers had not suffered any damage. A new attack was imminent. At 6:15, 4 B-26 bombers were ordered to attack the enemy carriers with torpedoes. They flew through the fog at low altitude and upon approaching were met by furious anti-aircraft fire and 6 Zeros. Still far from their target, they attempted to dodge the fire by zigzagging at an altitude of just 600 meters. 2 B-26 were shot down. Captain James Collins, leading the formation, managed to launch his torpedo from 800 yards from the Akagi, although his aircraft was seriously damaged. He was followed by Lieutenant Muri, who launched his torpedo to 450 yards and then flew along the deck firing with his machine guns. His attack damaged several anti-aircraft batteries, but his aircraft returned to Midway with 500 hits. Both bombers were disabled. Simultaneously, 6 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers led by Fieberling attacked the fleet. Only one managed to return, and it was severely damaged. Only 2 crew members survived. One of them, an ensign, could not confirm what happened to the other aircraft. A B-17 claimed to have seen a torpedo hit an aircraft carrier, although no damage was caused. Shortly afterwards, Major Lofton Henderson led 16 SBD-2 Dauntless dive bombers. Major Norris, commanding 12 Vindicators, followed behind. Henderson was the first to attack, and although his pilots claimed to have shot down 4 to 6 Zeros and hit the Hiryū, they actually only sprayed it with seawater. Only half of their aircraft returned. Henderson was killed when his burning aircraft crashed. At 8:10, 15 B-17s under the command of Colonel Walter Sweeney circled over the enemy carriers. Divided into 2 groups, each attacked a different target. The 500 and 600-pound bombs descended for 30 seconds, but the ships maneuvered effectively to avoid them. None hit. The B-17s returned unscathed, and their crews erroneously claimed to have scored 3 hits. Norris's group faced an even worse situation. The Vindicators were obsolete and fragile, incapable even of diving. Their pilots were novices. Upon arrival, Norris diverted the attack toward the battleship Haruna, using a glide bombing technique. His gunners claimed to have shot down 5 Zeros, but the Haruna also shot down 5 Vindicators. By the conclusion of the attacks from Midway, Nimitz's staff estimated that perhaps 1 or 2 ships had been sunk and as many as 10 damaged, although no serious hits had actually been scored. Nimitz himself, aware of the gravity of the moment, wrote, "Most of Midway's fighters, torpedo bombers and dive bombers, the only aircraft with a high probability of hitting naval targets, have been eliminated." Now everything depended on the American aircraft carriers. Time was running out. At that very moment, Japanese Commander Tomonaga informed Nagumo of the urgent need to launch a second attack. Heading for defeat. During the night of June 3rd to 4th, Admiral Fletcher moved his carriers to a position 200 miles north of Midway. From there, his planes could flank the Japanese aircraft flying east-west from the carriers toward the atoll. During the preliminary war games, Yamamoto had asked Nagumo what he would do if the Americans appeared on his flank. Nagumo's air officer replied, "We will annihilate them." Midway patrol report confirming the presence of enemy aircraft. At 6:05 a.m., Fletcher, still without revealing his own aircraft, ordered Spruance to Task Force 16 will prepare to attack. At 7 a.m., the aircraft carriers Enterprise and Hornet turned into the southeast wind and increased speed to 25 knots to facilitate the takeoff of their aircraft. For the next hour, they took off in this order: patrol fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and escort aircraft. The process was slow and complicated. Captain George Murray of the Enterprise, facing the delay, ordered his bombers to take off without waiting for an escort. The Hornet also ran into problems. While the Japanese had launched 108 aircraft in 7 minutes against Midway, it took the Americans an hour to launch a smaller number. Nevertheless, by 8 a.m., there were 68 dive bombers, 29 torpedo bombers, and 20 fighters in the air. At this point, Nimitz received an unexpected advantage. At 7:40 a.m., Nagumo received a report from a scout claiming to have sighted 10 enemy vessels advancing toward his attack route. Nagumo was in the midst of rearming and refueling his aircraft for a second wave on Midway. He now faced 3 simultaneous and conflicting tasks: preparing for a second wave against Midway, launching an attack on the American fleet, and recovering the aircraft returning from the first attack. Attacking the carriers required shifting the weapons already mounted to bombard the atoll. In the absence of clear confirmation of the sighting, Nagumo opted to continue preparations for an attack on Midway. This decision has been hotly debated ever since, but it is unlikely that any action, beyond maneuvering out of range, would have prevented the impending disaster. At 8:20 a.m., a new report confirmed that among the ships sighted was at least one enemy aircraft carrier. At that point, Nagumo had no aircraft ready for takeoff, and unbeknownst to him, the American planes were already flying toward him. He was literally out of options. By 8:38 a.m., the Yorktown had recovered its aircraft and was ready to go into action. Unlike the Hornet and Enterprise, the Yorktown crew managed to launch their planes in just half an hour. Operator William Roy recalled the scene from the signal bridge: a deep blue sea under a clear sky with scattered clouds, roaring engines, smoke, and sailors working with precision to get the planes airborne. Although the precise location of the Japanese carriers was still unknown, Fletcher suspected that his ships had been spotted by an enemy scout. He could not risk being attacked with his hangars full, so he launched all available aircraft. By 9:06 a.m. he had 12 torpedo bombers, 17 bombers, and 6 fighters in the air. He held 17 dive bombers in reserve, hoping to spot the other 2 enemy carriers. At 9:45 a.m. his planes regrouped for Akagi and Kaga. Almost simultaneously, the Japanese carriers began receiving their aircraft returning from Midway. Kaga completed this operation at 8:50, followed by Akagi. Nagumo, now aware of the presence of enemy carriers, turned north in the hope of catching them in the act of launching. Fletcher was informed of the course change, but his pilots, under strict radio silence, were unable to receive the new information. Upon reaching the estimated rendezvous point, they did not encounter the carriers. The Hornet's 10 fighters exhausted their fuel and crashed into the sea. 8 pilots were rescued. All 35 bombers returned except for 2. The fate of the Hornet's torpedo bomber squadron was different. Without finding their target, Commander Waldron diverted north at 8:25 and encountered the Akagi, Kaga, and Sōryū. Without fighter escort, his 15 torpedo bombers descended to sea level and attempted to launch their faulty torpedoes. Only Ensign George Gay survived. His aircraft was hit by 5 Zeros, lost control, and ditched. Hidden under his seat cushion until nightfall, he survived 30 hours at sea before being rescued. No torpedoes scored a hit, and all of Waldron's aircraft were destroyed. Shortly thereafter, Commander Lindsay led 14 Devastators from the Enterprise in an attack against the Kaga. Also unescorted, his planes were swept away by enemy fighters. Only 4 returned, inflicting no damage. The final wave of torpedo boats was led by Commander Lance Massey from the Yorktown, with 12 Devastators and 6 fighters under the command of John Thach. At 14 miles range, they were intercepted by at least 20 Zeros. Thach attempted to execute his weave tactic, but he failed to protect the torpedo boats. 10 were shot down. No torpedoes hit. Massey was killed in action and was awarded the Navy Cross for valor. By 10:20 a.m., after hours of combat, the Americans had not scored a single effective hit. 3 Japanese aircraft carriers had been attacked, and the 4th had not been located. Despite optimistic reports, there was no concrete evidence that the enemy had been weakened. The price was extremely high. Hornet Squadron 8 was annihilated, and the torpedo boat squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown had suffered heavy losses. The official report stated that the morning's actions had altered Japanese tactics, but a more realistic assessment indicated that Japan was close to a decisive victory. The turning point. Commander Clarence McCluskey, commanding the Enterprise bombers, had failed to find the enemy carriers in their estimated position. At 9:45 a.m., he made a key decision. He turned north, assuming the Japanese had changed course. Nimitz would later write that this was one of the most important decisions of the entire battle. Shortly thereafter, McCluskey sighted the Japanese destroyer Arashi, steaming north at full speed. He deduced that it must be returning to its carrier group. Following in its wake, he soon spotted the Kaga. Because of Yamamoto's ambitious plan, which dispersed his forces between Midway and the enemy fleet, the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were refueling and rearming their aircraft, many of them still in the hangars. In the air, there were no Zero fighters left. When the Kaga's lookouts spotted the American bombers, they shouted, "Hell, divers!" McCluskey's planes descended like a silver waterfall. The first bombs missed, but one hit a group of planes on the deck. Then two more hit the hangar, detonating fuel and explosives. The Kaga was consumed by flames. Lieutenant Richard Best noticed that everyone was attacking the Kaga and decided to redirect 3 aircraft toward the still undamaged Akagi. Despite Captain Okada's evasive maneuvers, one of Best's bombs penetrated the deck and exploded among the aircraft in the hangar. The Akagi was severely damaged within minutes. Simultaneously, Commander Maxwell Leslie of the Yorktown attacked the Sōryū with his Dauntlesses. Despite having lost his own bomb earlier, his squadron scored accurate hits that reduced the carrier to a burning wreck in just 2 minutes. Some aircraft, still fueled and ammunition-laden, attacked a nearby battleship and cruiser. In 5 minutes, the Americans had gone from certain defeat to virtually guaranteed victory. Of the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, only the Hiryū remained operational. Without detracting from American valor, it was Yamamoto who, by dispersing his fleet and leaving his carriers without air protection, facilitated the catastrophe. In Hawaii, Nimitz, cut off from his carriers, interpreted the radio silence as a good sign. The Japanese could not transmit because they had been destroyed. At 10:45, the order was given to abandon the Sōryū, but Nagumo did not give up. He transferred to the cruiser Nagara and began planning a counterattack against the Yorktown, while the Hiryū prepared to launch its final attack. The second Japanese attack on the Yorktown was undoubtedly a tactical success for Nagumo. However, he achieved this at the cost of further depleting his already meager aircraft reserves. Now aware that the Americans still had at least 2 operational aircraft carriers nearby, he finally accepted the need to withdraw. He waited for the Hiryū to recover its aircraft and then headed northwest, hoping to escape enemy range. Had he abandoned the field immediately after the first attack, the Hiryū might have survived, but its end was closer than Nagumo could have foreseen. As the Yorktown burned, Lieutenant Samuel Adams, who already held 2 Navy crosses, circled the area in search of the Hiryū. At 2:30 p.m., Fletcher received the news he had been waiting for. Adams had located the carrier along with its escort of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Retaliation was immediately coordinated from the Enterprise. At 2:45 p.m., a strike force of 26 aircraft led by Lieutenant Earl began to form. Gallagher. By 3:25 p.m., they were airborne toward the enemy, and half an hour later, the Hornet also launched another 16 dive bombers. At 17:05, the Enterprise formation encountered a weak barrage of 0 fighters. 6 to 12 enemy aircraft attacked, shooting down 3 Americans, 1 before and 2 after the bombing run, but failed to halt the onslaught. From 19,000 feet, the bombers swooped down on the Hiryū in an uncoordinated but devastating attack. Lieutenant Shumway is believed to have scored the first hit. 3 more 1,000-pound bombs followed with lethal accuracy. All struck the forward section of the flight deck, which was virtually ripped to shreds. The explosions, combined with bomb and aircraft fragments, turned the Hiryū into a floating inferno. Despite the chaos, damage control teams attempted to salvage the still-burning ship, but she was doomed. Gallagher, for his decisive role in this mission, was awarded the Navy Cross for valor and tenacity. Hornet's aircraft reached the target at 5:20 p.m. The Hiryū was already too badly damaged to warrant another attack. They then redirected their bombs against the escort vessels. Hits were reported on a battleship and a cruiser, although these could not later be confirmed. For the first time that day, all participating aircraft returned to their carriers. At 17:30, Spruance asked Fletcher for instructions. The answer was simple. With no carriers under his command, he would follow Spruance's orders. Although 4 enemy carriers had been eliminated, Spruance suspected a 5th might be in the offing. Furthermore, numerous Japanese surface ships remained undamaged. The strategic objective of neutralizing the enemy's embarked air force had now been achieved. Risking the American carriers unnecessarily would be foolish. Therefore, during the night, he set a course eastward. As Nagumo grappled with the day's disastrous outcome, Yamamoto ordered his forces at 7:15 p.m. to pursue the American fleet and prepare to land at Midway. Optimistic, he instructed the mobile force to locate and engage the enemy immediately. However, before Nagumo could carry out that order, he was relieved of command at 10:55 p.m. Vice Admiral Kondo assumed control and ordered a night fight prepared. Yamamoto soon reconsidered. He reversed the operation and ordered the landing cancelled, withdrawing his forces beyond the range of the American aircraft carriers. At that point, the Americans still did not know that the invasion had been aborted, and Nimitz insisted that his commanders not underestimate Japanese stubbornness. Meanwhile, in Midway, at 3 p.m. on June 4th, the situation remained critical. Captain Logan Ramsey, Chief of Defensive Operations, described in his log that things were looking very bleak. With an attack by surface ships imminent, he began planning the evacuation of non-essential personnel. But soon after, news of the successful attack on the Japanese aircraft carriers arrived, changing the situation completely. Even so, the threat of an approaching enemy squadron remained real. The main obstacle was refueling the planes, which was now done entirely manually. With difficulty, they managed to get 4 B-17 aircraft airborne, which met 6 others in flight from Molokai. They launched a few attacks, but the targets were mostly smoking or already disabled ships. Later, the last operational SBDs and SB-2U-3s took off, under the command of Captain Marshall Taylor and Major Benjamin Norris. The weather was appalling. Gusty winds, rain, and low clouds. They found no targets. Norris did not return. His bravery during the early morning attack had probably already earned him the Navy Cross, but this final mission, carried out under extreme conditions, sealed his posthumous award. By nightfall on June 4, 1942, the Battle of Midway had already turned decisive. 2 of the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, Sōryū and Kaga, were lost entirely. Some contemporary accounts suggested that they were sunk as a direct result of damage caused by American bombing. However, subsequent investigations and survivor accounts reveal that both ships, although severely damaged and uncontrollable, were ultimately sunk by their own crews. This was a common practice in the Imperial Japanese Navy, which preferred to destroy its own ships rather than allow them to be captured or hinder the maneuvers of the rest of the fleet. During the early hours of the following day, the Hiryū, the only Japanese aircraft carrier that had managed to remain operational until the afternoon of June 4th, was also declared a total loss. Vice Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, aboard the ship, realized that there was no way to save her. Severely damaged by dive bombers from the Enterprise and Hornet, the Hiryū was burning from bow to stern. The chain explosions, caused by aviation fuel and stored bombs, had left the ship unsteerable and unrecoverable. In an act of extreme fidelity to samurai tradition, Yamaguchi refused to abandon ship. While giving the evacuation order for his crew, he himself decided to remain aboard and share the fate of his ship, along with Captain Tomeo Kaku. In the early hours of June 5th, the Hiryū's hull was sunk by torpedoes launched from Japanese destroyers in a deliberate act to prevent her from falling into enemy hands or becoming an obstacle to navigation. The last to be sunk was the Akagi, flagship of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. After being bombarded on the morning of June 4th, the Akagi lay immobile, her bow covered in raging fires and her internal structure devastated. For hours, damage control teams attempted to keep the ship afloat, but the scale of the explosions in the hangars made repairs impossible. Although Nagumo was initially reluctant to abandon his ship, he was eventually persuaded to transfer to the cruiser Nagara, from where he briefly assumed command of what remained of the Japanese attack force. At dawn on June 5th, the decision was made to scuttle the Akagi. Several destroyers fired torpedoes, and the one-time symbol of Japanese air and naval power disappeared beneath the waves. By 9 a.m. on June 5th, what remained of the Kido Butai, the world's most powerful carrier force at that time, was in retreat, scattered, and demoralized. The surviving units, including some cruisers, destroyers, and battleships that had not been directly hit, were trying to regroup, heading west out of range of American aircraft. They had lost not only 4 carriers, but also nearly 250 carrier-based aircraft and more than 3,000 sailors and airmen, including several of their most experienced veteran pilots. The blow was irreparable. In Hawaii, aware of the magnitude of the Japanese disaster thanks to intercepted messages and reports from his commanders, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz relayed a message to his men. Exultant, he congratulated them for having written a glorious page in our history. The official report prepared that morning described the previous day as the greatest naval battle since Jutland, referring to the Great World War I engagement between the British and German fleets. On June 5th, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, now without the Yorktown, began the day with a report to Nimitz summarizing the extent of the Allied triumph. He reported that all 4 enemy carriers were either burning or sunk, that at least 1 heavy battleship and cruiser had been severely damaged, and that other Japanese units might have suffered hits as well. He made no secret that air losses had been significant, particularly among the torpedo boat squadrons, but expressed his intention to continue the offensive. His plan was to approach Midway to intercept what remained of a suspected Japanese force located 50 miles west of the atoll, possibly part of the invasion force. At 11 o'clock, Admiral Raymond Spruance, in temporary command of the task force following the loss of the Yorktown, gave the order to head northwest. His objective was to intercept the retreating Japanese fleet. Throughout the day, he received several fragmentary reports of enemy ship sightings, attacks on isolated units, and even potential sinkings. But none of this information could be accurately confirmed. When the Enterprise and Hornet reached the operational limit of their aircraft, about 315 miles from their position, they encountered no contact with relevant enemy units. Spruance then assessed that continuing the pursuit would be futile. The weather was beginning to deteriorate and forecasts predicted storms in the area. Furthermore, continuing an operation without accurate intelligence about the enemy in such a vast region of the Pacific was an unnecessary risk. The primary strategic objective had already been achieved, destroying the core of the Japanese aircraft carrier fleet. Prudence now dictated preserving American resources. To avoid any unexpected encounters during the night with the still unlocated Japanese invasion force, Spruance reduced speed to 15 knots. Despite this cautious approach, on June 6th, Spruance authorized a series of additional airstrikes. Several waves of airstrikes were launched from the Hornet and Enterprise with the intention of harassing any Japanese units still in the area. These attacks reported hits on at least 2 cruisers and 1 destroyer. While the reports were optimistic, the strategic effect of these actions was limited. The attacked ships were already withdrawing and no longer posed a direct threat. However, these operations showed that, despite having achieved a great victory, the Americans were not willing to give respite to a still dangerous enemy. For its part, the Japanese invasion force, composed of transports, destroyers, and some support units, which was originally headed toward Midway, was ordered to withdraw. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who until then had been reluctant to abandon the operation, finally accepted the new reality. On the night of June 5th to 6th, he issued the final order. The invasion of Midway was cancelled. His forces would regroup out of range of American aircraft and begin the return journey to Japan. This moment marked the end of the battle. The Imperial Japanese Navy had not only suffered the loss of its most important aircraft carriers, but had also failed in its attempt to shift the strategic balance in the Pacific. It would never regain the initiative. Midway was not just a battle won, it was an irreversible turning point. As for the Yorktown, the day after the attack she was hooked by the minesweeper Hiryū to be towed toward Pearl Harbor at a speed of 3 knots. The effort failed and the tow was abandoned that afternoon. For the remainder of the day and into the early morning of the 6th, destroyers such as the Gwyn, Monaghan, Hammond, Bulk and Benham protected the Yorktown while salvage efforts were prepared. At dawn, Captain Buckmaster came aboard with 29 officers and 130 men. They worked to extinguish fires, bail out water, and lighten the ship to correct the list. William Roy, the photographer, participated in these tasks while documenting the efforts. The Hammond, docked alongside the Yorktown, supplied power, water, and firefighting foam. The results were promising. The list was reduced by 2 degrees and some fires brought under control. But at 1:35 p.m. the alarm sounded. Torpedo attack. 2 wakes were spotted approaching at full speed. The torpedoes passed uninterrupted. The first struck the Yorktown. The second cut the Hammond in 2, which sank within minutes. Several sailors were left in the water. The Yorktown also suffered further damage, although ironically one of the hits balanced its list. Hammond survivors was a priority. The salvage operation for the Yorktown would have to wait, but there was no time. During the night the list worsened. At 5:01 a.m. on June 7th, the carrier capsized and sank, with all her battle colours flying, according to Buckmaster. Following the defeat at the Battle of Midway, The remnants of the Kido Butai, the Imperial Japanese Navy's primary carrier striking force, returned to Japan on June 10, 1942. Japanese authorities attempted to downplay the scale of the disaster, publicly reporting the loss of only one carrier and another severely damaged. However, the reality was far grimmer. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, and Hiryū, and 1 heavy cruiser had been sunk, 248 aircraft destroyed, and approximately 3,000 Japanese sailors lost their lives. The loss of these 4 aircraft carriers represented a devastating blow to the Imperial Japanese Navy. These ships had been instrumental in Japanese offensive operations during the early months of the Pacific War, participating in attacks such as Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean Raid. Their destruction at Midway meant the elimination of a substantial portion of Japan's naval power projection capability. In contrast, in Hawaii, news of the victory at Midway was greeted with jubilation. Admiral Ernest King publicly congratulated Admiral Chester W. Nimitz and his men for their gallant and effective performance. American losses, though significant, were minor in comparison. 1 aircraft carrier, USS Yorktown, CVI-5, 1 destroyer, about 150 aircraft, and approximately 300 men. The USS Yorktown had been crucial in the battle. Despite damage sustained in the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, she was quickly repaired at Pearl Harbor and was ready to participate in Midway. During the battle, the Yorktown was attacked multiple times. On June 4th, she was hit by bombs dropped by Japanese aircraft, causing fires and significant damage. Despite heroic efforts by her crew to keep her afloat, on June 6th, she was torpedoed by the Japanese submarine 1168, leading to her final sinking. Despite the victory, Admiral Nimitz did not indulge in triumphalism. A third of his post-battle report focused on areas for improvement. He criticized the vulnerability of the PBY Catalina flying boats to enemy fighters and suggested replacing them with bombers like the B-17 Flying Squirrel. Fortress, or the B-24 Liberator, which offered greater endurance and defensive capability. He also highlighted the inadequacy of the TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, which had suffered devastating losses during attacks on Japanese aircraft carriers. The F-4F4 Wildcat, although robust, was noted as inferior to the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 in speed, maneuverability, and rate of climb. Nimitz also emphasized the need to develop torpedoes that could be launched at high speed. During the battle, the heaviest losses among American torpedo planes occurred when they slowed down to launch their torpedoes, making them easy targets for enemy fighters. He also urged accelerated production of 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs. He noted that, had these been available at Midway, more enemy ships would have been sunk or disabled after being hit. The Battle of Midway also highlighted the importance of intelligence and reconnaissance in naval operations. The U.S. Navy's ability to decipher Japanese naval codes allowed it to anticipate enemy movements and prepare an effective response. However, Nimitz acknowledged that while intelligence had been crucial to victory, it also revealed deficiencies in aerial reconnaissance operations and coordination between different units. In terms of doctrine and tactics, the battle highlighted the need for improved coordination between carrier-based air groups and surface forces. The dispersion of U.S. air attacks, although ultimately effective, demonstrated the lack of a unified doctrine for aircraft carrier operations. This lesson would lead the U.S. Navy to develop more coordinated and efficient tactics for the use of its air and naval forces in future operations. The victory at Midway had far-reaching strategic repercussions. It marked the turning point in the Pacific War, halting Japanese expansion and handing the initiative to the Allied forces. The loss of 4 of its main aircraft carriers and experienced pilots significantly weakened the Imperial Japanese Navy's offensive capability, from which it would never fully recover. This battle demonstrated the importance of air and naval superiority, and how intelligence, preparation, and adaptability are crucial to the outcome of military conflicts.